Hi, this is Paul. I wanted to make a video on this comment left by Colt Redwine. And I like comments that disagree with me. I learn from comments that disagree with me because it's our eyes face out and it's very difficult to see ourselves except through each other. And so comments like this I find very helpful. And I know sometimes people feel a little embarrassed about leaving critical or negative comments. I don't think they should. Actually, when I do a video, I sort of judge the success of the video by how many negative comments there are, which meant that the recent videos I've done about Michael Malice I thought were particularly successful. In fact, this Friday on Bridges of Meaning, I'm going to be having a conversation with Ginger Bill, who left some meaty comments on it. And Ginger Bill is a big part of the Bridges of Meaning Discord, and he disagreed with me a lot over my take on Michael Malice. And so we're going to talk about that. And instead of the usual Friday question and answer, we do a lot of question and answer, so I don't mind breaking it up and doing some other things. Instead of this week's question and answer, Ginger Bill and I are going to talk about that. So it's up to him whether or not we'll stream it. I don't know how much he wants to be on YouTube, but it's going to be in the Bridges of Meaning, and if he agrees to it, then we'll stream it. My face will be on, his face likely won't be on. So I'm going to read this comment, and I'm going to respond to it, because I thought it was a good comment. Because I can see myself, at least see how I'm seen. Now, I also have been a pastor long enough to know that everyone's view of me is filtered through themselves. So I've got a really robust ego, and my feelings usually aren't hurt very badly, especially when people are, if someone's, anyway, I'll read the comment. I get a lot from Vanderklay videos, but I have to apologize for the fact that sometimes they offer me a kind of resistance and opposing ideology which helps my own understanding in a dissenting way. No need to apologize. That's what good conversation is for. Even if we're having... C.S. Lewis had... his first friend was Arthur Greeves, who was a friend from childhood for C.S. Lewis. His second friend was Owen Barfield. And C.S. Lewis had all kinds of crazy ideas. One of his ideas was that your second friend is supposed to be someone that you basically love arguing with. They get everything wrong in your opinion, but your conversations with them are fun and fruitful. And so we should have all sorts of second friends in our lives. One of the comments that Peterson made to Peugeot about fans, I thought was, fans are not anywhere near as helpful as the right kinds of critics. Our critics do us a tremendous service because they sharpen us. Even if our critics are wrong, they can still, there's always wrongness in us that can be set right. And so again, I'm really looking forward to talking to Ginger Bill about Michael Malice, because I said from the beginning, I know very little about Michael Malice. But this Colt's points here are much more theological and spiritual than they are political here. So let's keep going. All of Vanderklay's videos are underwritten with the immutable, unspoken, and unquestioned understanding that any viewpoint, irrational, pragmatic, or spiritual, which varies from his theology and his ossified, a lot of people think I'm not ossified enough, but we'll continue. Ossified Christian religious consensual interpretation is simply a diluted, I don't know, maybe you've meant diluted. That's often a word that, attempt to embrace yet another secular but false religion. Well, yes. Because I have ideas, and if I thought my ideas were wrong, I'd change them. I don't find this to be any different from anybody else's ideas, that they see the world correctly, and everybody, to one degree or another, sees it a bit wrong, because if I saw a better way of seeing the world, I would adopt it. So, no apologies there, but ossified. This gets into a lot of the rest of my commentary on this, too. Or it may be seen as watered down, confused, but respectable enough to eventually reach the deep, more realistic truth which me, and those who agree with him possess. I don't know how many people agree with me. But, that whole business about agreement is a pretty big thing. I can sit down with even very close friends of mine who are also Christian Reformed pastors where we agree on a whole bunch of stuff and we'll find acres of disagreement between us. And life is just this way. Well, let's continue. He never, two nevers, all in caps, asks question of himself. If you only knew. If you only knew how much self-questioning I do. In fact, this whole channel is about me and my own questions about myself. I was just sitting down here after having a conversation with a colleague about, that colleague, a friend of mine, he was baptized in this building. And he's also a pastor now, and he pastors one of our church plants. And we both have our different struggles. I have, my seniors are dying and struggling with various illnesses. He has young people who are trying to make their way in the world, probably like a lot of the people who watch this channel, figuring out what right or wrong. And he's still figuring out many things in himself. I question myself every day. And in fact, a lot of the reason I talk so much on this channel is I am questioning myself. Now, I also know about myself that I appear far more confident than I really am. I've learned that over the years because people seem like, you're very sure of yourself. And I think, really? I don't feel that way from the inside. I guess that I look that way from the outside. But I question myself all the time. And maybe it doesn't come through enough, but you'll have to take my word for it. Our pastors preach the church apologist, offering us a dull gray fog of enervating religious misunderstanding, a sickly God chasing people away from the church and towards a beautiful, vital God. And now he's starting to reveal, perhaps, and I may get him completely wrong, and maybe will correct me in the comment section if he's still watching the channel, or he might miss the comment entirely. And so I'll just give the interpretation I have of that sentence, which may be totally wrong. It's sort of the idea that, people who leave the church suddenly the church has somehow retarded their spiritual ecstasies. And once they're freed from the oppression of the church, suddenly they go off into sure religious bliss. Now, there certainly may be some people like that, and I have some friends who are New Agers who would testify to something like that. They maybe were raised in a church, Roman Catholic Church for many of them when they were young, and then when they grew old enough, they've done psychedelics, and they have spiritual practices, and they have tuning forks, and they have crystals, and they have meditation, and they have retreats, and they have all kinds of different practices that afford ecstasies of various kinds, some of them sexual, some of them not. But so I do know people like that who very much see the church as narrow and straight-laced. But the truth is, most of the people I know who wander away from church just sort of slide into American consumerism and live that way. And they certainly like having their Sunday mornings back. And every now and then they feel happy that they're, sort of free from that whole thing. And many of them really don't want to go back. But I don't find their life improved necessarily by their decision. They obviously think so, or they would change their mind. But I certainly don't find that in somehow the church was sort of a wet blanket on their spiritual evolution. And maybe for some it is. But now, having since left the church, they're full of spiritual ecstasy. What I find is that they're just usually full of American consumerism and whatever spiritual ideas they sort of pick up along the way here and there. For the most part, I find their lives quite a bit less disciplined spiritually, which means often, again, just sort of subject to the mean. I almost erased this video. I had to move a fridge, and so now I'm back and talked to a guy who told me his head gasket busted, and so his car's in the parking lot, and his friend has a rather outrageous wig and dress and was walking a big mean dog through the homeless through the homeless guy's stuff over in the corner, and it's just the way my life is in this crazy world. Anyway, and then I thought, well, I shouldn't continue with this video because it's just too easy. The asymmetry of me pulling one comment apart is so potentially unfair, and I do want to be kind and generous, and I am appreciative, but it's the comment itself provoked a lot of thoughts as a pastor. He never asked questions of himself. Oh gosh, I'm always asking questions of myself, but maybe never. But the way that it continues to go, is it possible the theology of Vanderklay is diluted, watered down version of true spirituality? And again, you sort of have to, if you're not having a face-to-face live conversation with someone about it, you don't quite know where they're coming from, because people are usually making these comments from particular points of view. And so when I read the comments, I try to guess where are they coming from. And one way to think about this is sort of a quadrant. You've got heaven and earth, and you've got individual and communal. And that's sort of one way to chart, let's say, the spiritualities available to most people, because as in the Peterson Doyle video, there's nothing new under the sun. And so as I listen to people, I've never actually made this chart before, and I've never actually drawn it out, but sort of in my thinking about what they're proposing, or at least believing in, is it closer to heaven or closer to earth? Is it immaterial or material? Is it individual or communal? So a lot of times someone who looks at theology, something very logos driven, will see it as, well, it's quite communal, because usually communities come up with this language, and it's not terribly mystical. Let's use that word, because it can be dry, and it can be contained, it can be civilized. It is, in a sense, on a leash, as opposed to something which is usually individual and very mythical or esoteric, which is just sort of free. It's an experience that they have, and no one can question them. Now, I'm actually thinking a lot about this because I'm going through the book of Acts in my Sunday sermons, and one of the things that is quite clear is Paul places a lot of stock on his Damascus Road experience and on the revelations that will come. He talks about them repeatedly, usually not in much detail, but if you read his epistles closely, you'll see that Paul was very much one given to ecstatic, individual, mystical experiences. And he based a lot of his authority on these experiences. Now, this very much splits people, because the funny thing about these experiences is that usually for the individual, they're all-encompassing, and they might very much lead to their own dogmatism, because seeing is believing, and even if they're not seeing what everyone else is seeing, they certainly believe it, and they go off with it. And that's very much the Apostle Paul. That is sort of the flip side to a sort of rationality, which is much more communal, which rationality sort of assumes that lots of people can follow the same steps and come to the same conclusions. And theology, written theology, the discipline of theology, especially now in 2021, which has been through a severely modernistic period, very much has that sense of it. And so in that way, rationality is much more communal than individual, and empiricism is far more individual. So is it possible the theology of Vanderklay is diluted, watered down version of true spirituality? And I assume true spirituality would be much more empirical and less rational. But now here's where we get into audience, because on the channel, as in my life, even though Living Stones is little, it's astoundingly diverse. And I have always managed to live and foster very diverse communities. I don't know why. It's just always been true about me. Now, diversity is enormous, and so the diversity range is limited, of course, that tend to clump around me. Becoming, transformation, and union with God, our own highest ideals, and the heaven which is within us. Now, a little bit later, well, you're going to get to that, highly materialistic. And so, okay, God as an eternal, infinite state of becoming and union rather than a celestial monarch to our wretched, helpless, untrustworthy subjection. So just listening to him, I would put this much more on the individual heaven. The difficulty with mysticism is it doesn't have a lot of shelf life. It's very much a religion of the moment. And then the question and the challenge of individualism is, in fact, can it stay? I remember the old Dan Fogelberg song, How Can We Make Love Stay? Well, that definition of love, sort of like this definition of spirituality, is individual, it's experiential, but in my experience, people who tend to major in this have a lot of difficulty in forming and sustaining community, especially over time. Exceptions would be those who have these experiences and then go on to, in fact, do other things that involve the rational and the communal, because it's those kinds of things, those kinds of ideas that communities, stable communities, can actually form. And no one has to tell me how much there is wrong with the church. But some of what the church has managed to do is endure. And that gets into some ways Jordan Peterson, Darwinian truth. The theology of Vanderklay is highly, all caps, materialistic. And again, I think for some of you, it's not materialistic enough. For others of you, it's way too materialistic. And again, looking at this, there's rationality, but very quickly you get into the question, okay, would your ideal life be living in the desert with a lifelong supply of hallucinogens and at least enough fans to keep body and soul together? How long would you want to live? Would you want to have people listen to the reportings of your ecstatic experiences? Because again, if you read history, you'll find that all of this has been tried. All of this has been experienced. All of this is out there. And it's out there across the board of world religions. You can find it in Christianity. You can find it in Judaism. You can find it in Hinduism. You can find it in shamanistic, animistic traditions. When I look at these things and at these quadrants, I see actually rather stable patterns throughout human history by which we can sort of plot these things. And because I'm a pastor, I am very interested in the communal and the sustainable. Now, maybe that's just a version of my preachcraft because I like to get paid. And I know you can find Christians that are highly individualistic, highly heaven-oriented, and I could bring them up on YouTube, which would send a good amount of the rest of my audience leaving howling. Much more than Peterson. Peterson, again, is sort of definitely has a mystical edge, which drives him. But Peterson is also highly rationalistic and highly materialistic. And I would argue his skepticism of the resurrection makes him, in some ways, more materialistic than I am. And which we're going to get into a little bit later in this comment, because what you begin to see is that, and as a pastor who actually for a living with a fair amount of experience sits down and talks and pays attention to people, a sort of a quadrant system like this kind of is helpful in understanding people. Who combines pragmatic psychology with deep allegory and metaphorical profundity, which presents as far more religious than Vanderklay. Well, it kind of depends on your definition of religion. Because religio is a ligament. It's a binding. And so I would say what binds Peterson is science and materialism to a degree. Those are his bindings, and it's his mystical experiences that drive him to the edge of what Sam Harris thinks is responsible for a real materialist and for real science. When Vanderklay says trust Jesus more than himself, he means trust the Bible and the church and don't trust yourself. And no, my trust Jesus is rather experiential, but I have in my experience learned not to trust myself in many respects, because it's when I am full of enthusiasm, as I've learned over life, that I sometimes make my biggest errors. When I'm so sure because of a certain, it might not be an ecstatic or a mystical vision, but it's often a vision for a future which I seek to mobilize my resources and move a community towards. Oh, be careful of those enthusiasms, because often there's so much about me. And, well, you might find yourself surrounded by fans and a following, but then it's all on you, my friend. Then it's all on you when you drive them into a corner and have them throw down the little tools that you've given them in their hands, and they say, it doesn't work. Jesus, to those of us who believe, remains a profound, essential, and allegorical truth. But as an abstraction as far as our own lives are concerned. In other words, the historical Jesus is meaningless. The stories are simply there. And therefore, now we kind of have an interesting duality, though, because in my opinion, the literalism, which he's going to talk about later, is often a function simply of sociological bullying. Because you lose status if you say things like, I believe Jesus rose from the dead, in certain materialistic communities. And in many of those materialistic communities, it's fine to have your own mystical experiences as long as you keep them out of politics. But the minute you have a mystical experience and you try to bring that experience into the material world, people are going to say, excuse me. Because what secularism basically says is, have all the mystical playground you want. But the rules of the road down here are the empiricism that we see with our eyes and can touch with our hands. That's the ruling of the secular age. And it was developed as a way to curtail the kind of mystical fights that people were having over theology that they couldn't test. So, yeah, this world will be very happy if you keep it individual and you keep it all up in heaven, as long as you don't decide that, like Heaven's Gate, that you're all going to off yourselves together, or maybe that's just our residual Christian views about suicide. Vanderklay has no interest in a God who doesn't improve people's daily lives. Now, wait a minute. People's daily lives, let's say you're tripping through your 50s and 60s and living hand to mouth, and now you're going to live with those folks in Arizona in their cars because you can't make it because all you got is Social Security. Now, this is very much in contrast with, let's say, people who are materialistic on the earth side and on the communal side, which says that what's really important is economics. And what we really have to do is get everyone more money. And what we really have to do is rob from the rich and give to the poor. And if everyone had more money, well-being is merely a function of money. I thought well-being was the ecstatic experiences that we have as individual. I don't care about people's daily lives. That's a hard sell. Bring success, improve society and culture, compel a pleasant and functional world morality, and put butts in the seats of church. I'm not sure if he's saying that this is what I'm too much about and we shouldn't be about that. Just be more liberal with the psychedelics. And, with the whole psychedelic conversation, and again, I tend to be in the middle on this. I'm not as against them as some would like me to be. I'm certainly nowhere near as for them as many of you would like me to be. The problem that I have is that I've talked to a lot of people who have done it, and some say it's helped, and many says it's helped, but few of them have the idea that they just want to do mushrooms for the rest of their life. It's sort of given them a different perspective, but, and this is maybe where I'm more material, I'm very interested in where they go communally and what their life looks like on earth, because I am not a Gnostic. And I believe that the Creator God gets his hands dirty in making a man out of clay and breathing divine life into him. And Jesus worked with his hands. His hands were a good bit harder than mine, quite likely. So the meaning crisis, in addition, though sometimes presented as individual in its existence, it's both individual and communal, is really seen by van der Klee as a social and cultural phenomenon. Yeah, I think it is. It's also spiritual in the ways that I've been talking about spiritual in my last videos, which should be addressed in a worldly way. See, and that's sort of where I would differ from Vervaeke. And see, this is where, you look at me and Vervaeke and Peugeot and Peterson, and, well, we might start to map in interesting ways along this quadrant, a religion that's not a religion. And when John Vervaeke pursues various disciplines and meditation and an ecology of practices, and you could put Rafe Kelly on this too. I don't find Vervaeke or Rafe terribly against psychedelics, but they're very material. And they're very skeptical about some of the literalism that I don't care to be skeptical about. And I would argue that in many ways, Vervaeke, personally, I don't believe it exists on those terms. I believe van der Klee is far too materialistic in his approach. I think Vervaeke and Rafe Kelly would say I'm not sufficiently materialistic. I'm too spiritual, but much more in a communal sense. Also, van der Klee seems overly concerned with literal interpretation of the Bible. And again, for some of you, not literal enough, and for others of you, too literal. But this gets funny, and I think this helps understand the mapping here because, well, he'll say it himself in a minute here. Did Jesus actually eat lemon meringue pie and rise from the dead? Kidding with the pie. This sort of literal interpretation strips the Bible of all its depth, profundity, spirituality, purpose, meaning, and direction for our lives. But see, the direction for your life is the problem there, because if you read the text, and I would say that there are, in some ways, he sort of mirrors a Sam Harris who would say, well, I can read many other texts and feel inspiration, because it's sort of in that way that the Bible is supposed to be inspiring, because what really matters is, again, more up here in my head and the experience that I have than what I do with my life. But what is the connection between what I do with my life and where I live and how that impacts my mind? The Bible is written in parable, song, poetry, and metaphor, and a lot of narrative. And it's quite clear that the people of the Bible took that narrative very seriously. And in the New Testament, those who were waiting for the deliverance of Israel from a Messiah were not looking for a metaphorical Messiah. And in fact, Jesus was a little too much heaven than earth in terms of the Messiah that they were waiting for. There's lots of that stuff in the Bible, but I don't think you're paying enough attention to what the writers of the Old and New Testament really cared about. And there are a lot of Jews that I know you can talk to who, on one hand, would agree that, well, Jesus is a little too up the heaven spectrum than he should be. If he had really wanted to deliver the people of Israel, he should have taken out the Romans. But then again, he would also be too literal and too materialistic. And in my opinion, is obviously an allegorical mythology, teaching us, guiding us, directing us, energizing us, motivating us, and revealing our own transformation and eventual union with God, which we would never comprehend otherwise. Which God? And if that were as such, now I'm not arguing that the Bible isn't profitable in terms of helping us to experience mystical experiences and transformative experiences. Certainly was productive in the Apostle Paul's life. But if that was really what it was written for singularly, I think it would look a lot different. My own theology, which is my own path individually, and as I said before, what I find when people deconstruct is they might be fairly variable on the heaven and earth, mostly sort of settle down to earth. They tend to go towards, they tend to be, as Peterson and Andrew Doyle were talking, they tend to be increasingly non-player characters because they continue to sort of reflect the background of usually the kind of worldview that the media is portraying. But they also continue to slide towards the individual, and, well, individual and communal are also within a context, and so they are much more of an individual, just like all the other individuals. Differs from Vanderklay in that it looks like this. It is me who was born and lived as a child in the Garden of Innocence, who rebelled and ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Well, Christianity does do some of that. There's no question about that. And just listen to liturgies on Good Friday. It's us who crucified Jesus. So that type of substitution, yes, but it's not us, but it's me for him. Attempted to discern good and evil and learn to feel shame at my nakedness. It was me who tried to build a life away from the garden, sacrificed poorly, felt jealousy, suffered the strange torments of Job, killed off most of me, and began again like Noah, an inexplicable, irrational guiding voice like Abraham. It is me who must shed the old laws of society in my life. You're not getting that from Moses. Separate from the world, give my life away, lose the comforts of community, and stop defending myself to the world. It is me who must die to the world, alone, in pain, with difficulty on my cross. It is me who must experience the hell of this, suffer it, defeat it, rise again in transformative and perfected union with the God and heaven which live within me already and always. The God who is so much a part of me in my eternal becoming that he could well be described as love. And he just laid out how he sees it. And again, I could say, well, do you never question yourself? Or do you despise or at least resist others who don't see the way you do? Of course you do. And I don't despise you for that. That's just what having an opinion means, but my rational communal self. I can't explain or understand this transformation or state of becoming, but I believe it anyway. I guess I can't blame Vanderklay for not challenging himself with more painful honesty, and perhaps he does so privately. But I know of no other religious leader, I know of no other religious leaders who ever tolerate enough tough questions and personal metamorphosis and understanding. than you or than me. I'm not sure where that sentence goes. It's also important to recognize that when you have a religious leader like myself, who is one, a small little religious community, but yeah, a leader, especially in a confessional context, there's a degree to which I certainly must hold a party line and sometimes keep private certain thoughts and doubts. And I've known some people that have been actors on a stage in that way, which I don't believe I am. I try in my videos to be as transparent as I can. And the truth is, I really do believe the stuff that I talk about. I really do believe Jesus walked out of that tomb. I really do believe his disciples touched him. I really do believe Jesus is coming again. That one can feel kind of fraught sometimes, but I don't really have skepticism about his miracles. And maybe that's just a function of being deeply embedded within a particular sociological religious community. And that, I think, is, to a degree, at least for myself, something of the naivete that I find in others that I know who believe similarly to this individual, that I would expect that your experience and positions are as formed as my own. And I don't find this particular perspective in any way. Most Americans sort of applaud this sort of thing. N.T. Wright actually brings that out quite nicely because, you know, everyone's fine if you're having whatever individual religious idea you have, as long as you don't bring it into the political space. And if God suddenly reveals to you that abortion is evil and that you must found a movement that would be outside every abortion clinic with signs every day of the week, suddenly people's ideas about you and your personal religious revelations will turn. But as long as you sort of keep it quiet and keep it happy and don't draw any attention to yourself politically, most in our country, which I think the dominant politics of our country, religion of our country is politics, most in our country will simply let you go and let you have your own beliefs. Just be a libertarian about it. It would really be helpful to all of us if those with deep knowledge of their religion would resist becoming so hard-boiled, self-righteous. I'll agree to being hard-boiled. Well, I'm sure there's self-righteousness in me. And set in cement with their beliefs. But the paragraph above, you had your own position. Wouldn't you like to be set in cement of those beliefs? Or would you feel kind of bad if 10 years from now, when you're living out in a car in Arizona, maybe you've got money and maybe you hold down a job, I don't know. But if at some point you have regrets, maybe you would look at yourself 10 years before and imagine that you were hard-boiled because, I know, at least at my age, I've been a fair number of different things over the years. Now you see this little slice of me over the last 3 years. And it's different from the slice of me you would have seen 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. Maybe not that much, maybe not sufficiently to your liking, but we all do change. Then they can do more than point a finger and tell them that person is just doing Christianity wrong. I hope that's not what my channel is really about. And I know some of you will make comments that say, "Oh, Paul, don't feel bad. Your channel isn't about that. You don't feel self-righteous," and that's wonderful. Those are good comments to read too. But I mean, don't feel the need to do so because, again, maybe it's because I'm hard-boiled and self-righteous. But a comment like this doesn't really bother me. In fact, I quite enjoy it, because at least I get a sense of who he is. And if he keeps watching the channel and leaving comments, I'll have a better understanding of where his critique is coming from. And again, if you have sort of a plot like this, that can sort of help you figure out, okay, where am I on this plot? And of course, in some way I think, well, I'm right in the best place because, of course, if I thought I needed to be in a better place, I'd put it somewhere else. I may be misguided, of course, as I'm sure I am in many ways. But that's something for me to think about. So thank you, and thank you. And again, I hope I wasn't too hard on you in the comment with my commentary on your comment. But those are my thoughts. And, if you ever manage to snag a rando slot, and I think about, part of the difficulty is that, I think about him as compared to someone like Quackenbush, who I talked to a while ago. And for Quackenbush, I was way too spiritual and not sufficiently material and way not political enough. And again, in a comment like this, there's like zero politics in it. And that's telling, because the goal isn't necessarily one way to sort of gauge your own spirituality would be to ask, what if your spirituality took over? What would the world look like? And a little thought experiment like that can often be instructive. So anyway, thanks for your comments. I hope I wasn't too hard on your commentary, and I hope my little analysis of individual, communal, heaven and earth is helpful.